The worn leather wallet slipped from Lina's trembling fingers, scattering loose change across the rain-soaked pavement. A single $100 bill fluttered free, landing face up in a puddle of murky water. Lina, 24, with dark tangled hair plastered to her exhausted face, stared down at the money. Her threadbare coat offered no protection against the freezing rain as she bent down. She picked up the bill with shaking fingers. A strange warmth spread through her palm, unnatural against the cold. She frowned, wiping water from the note. Her daughter's face flashed in her mind. Sophia, 3 years old, pale from hunger, a persistent cough that kept her awake at night. Lina whispered into the empty street, "I just want her to be healthy again." The $100 bill glowed faintly in her hand. Lina stumbled back, nearly dropping it. A nearby street lamp flickered violently. She clutched the money against her chest and ran home. Inside the cramped apartment, Sophia coughed weakly from the corner mattress. Lina knelt beside her daughter. Sophia's cheeks were flushed with fever. She pressed her hand against the child's forehead. The heat vanished. Sophia's eyes fluttered open, her breathing eased. Color returned to her pale cheeks. Lina sobbed with relief, pressing Sophia against her chest. The $100 bill slipped from her fingers onto the floor. A loud crack echoed from the kitchen. Lina rushed in. The ceiling pipe had burst, flooding the entire room with dirty water. She grabbed the bill and fled the apartment, Sophia in her arms. The water reached the doorway behind them. They sheltered in a subway station. Lina tucked the bill safely into her pocket. Hours passed. Lina fell asleep, holding Sophia. A shadow approached, a man in a leather jacket, sniffing loudly. Marcus, 32, with gaunt cheeks and eyes sunken from sleepless nights, noticed the bill's corner peeking from Lina's pocket. His fingers twitched. He waited until Lina shifted in her sleep, then pulled the bill free with practiced precision. Marcus stumbled into an alley, staring at the $100 bill. He pressed it to his face, inhaling its scent. A voice echoed from the alley's darkness. "I need more product." Marcus turned, hiding the bill behind his back. The dealer, Gio, approached with narrowed eyes. Marcus paled. "I don't have the money." Marcus glanced at the bill. He whispered, "I need enough product to pay off my debt." The bill pulsed with warmth. Marcus shoved it into his pocket. Gio raised an eyebrow. Gio reached into his jacket. Marcus braced himself. Instead of a weapon, Gio pulled out several baggies. "Here, take it. We're good," Gio said, his eyes unfocused, like he was in a trance. He walked away without another word. Marcus stared at the product in his hands. His heart pounded. He could sell this. He could start over. He laughed, a broken sound. The alley's fire escape suddenly gave way above him. A metal ladder crashed down, scraping his shoulder. Marcus cried out, clutching his arm. Blood seeped through his shirt. He stumbled away from the alley. He found a street vendor selling hot dogs. He handed over the $100 bill. The vendor squinted at it suspiciously. "What's wrong with it?" Marcus asked, wincing from his injury. The vendor shrugged and took the bill. Marcus walked away, his bag of product hidden under his jacket. The vendor pocketed the bill without a second glance. The vendor, Delroy, 45, with a stained apron and tired eyes, tucked the bill into his cash box. He wiped his hands on his apron and counted his daily earnings. The $100 bill lay on top. His phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. His wife's surgery was approved. He had enough. Delroy cried silently. His wife had been waiting for months. He would pay the deposit in the morning. That night, Delroy walked home through the empty streets. He clutched the bill inside his jacket pocket. A brick crashed through a nearby storefront window. Delroy ducked, heart hammering. Delroy dropped the bill. It fluttered onto the sidewalk. A young woman in a paint-stained coat picked it up. Maya, 26, with short blue-streaked hair and calloused fingers, examined the $100 bill under a streetlight. She had been walking home from her gallery, her third rejection that week. The art world didn't want her. Maya whispered to the bill, "I wish my art would get recognized, even just once." The bill grew warm in her palm. Maya's eyes widened. She tucked it into her coat pocket. Her phone buzzed. An email. The Gallery of Contemporary Art wanted to feature her work. Maya ran home, laughing. She painted all night, inspired, creating her most powerful piece. By morning, the painting was finished. Maya looked at it, a smile of pure joy on her face. Her apartment caught fire. Smoke filled the room. Maya grabbed the painting and the bill and fled. She stood outside in the cold dawn, watching her life burn. The painting survived. Everything else was gone. Maya walked to the gallery, smoke-stained and hollow-eyed. The director took her painting. He gave her $100 bill, the same one. He smiled coldly. Your first payment. Maya stared at the bill. Her hand trembled as she placed it back in her pocket. She walked through the city, feeling the weight of the bill against her thigh. People walked past her. A businessman stepped out of a luxury car. He nearly bumped into Maya, dropping his briefcase. Maya helped him collect his scattered papers. The bill fell from her pocket. He picked it up. Victor Sterling, 52, with silver gray hair and an expensive suit, stared at the $100 bill. He knew money. He knew every kind of currency. This bill was different. It vibrated slightly against his skin. Victor pocketed the bill and gave Maya a dismissive nod. She walked away, relieved to be free of it. Victor entered his penthouse office. He poured himself a glass of water. The bill lay on his polished desk. He made a call. The offshore account. I need access. Now. His voice was calm, demanding. The bank manager hesitated on the phone. Sir, there are irregularities. Victor clenched his jaw. He whispered to the bill, I need this problem to disappear. The bill glowed. Victor's phone buzzed. A text message. The account was clear. The investigation was closed. Victor smiled, pleased. Then his laptop screen flickered and crashed. All his files corrupted. He grabbed the bill and threw it across the room. The bill fluttered behind a cabinet. Victor's assistant walked in. Victor pointed. Find it. She hesitated. The assistant, Clara, 29, with sharp features and tired eyes, crouched down and retrieved the bill. She felt the warmth, the strange energy. She didn't tell Victor. She kept it in her own pocket. Clara walked home that night, clutching the bill. She had been saving for her mother's surgery. She whispered to the bill, I wish I had enough money to save my mother. She reached her apartment. Inside, her mother's breathing came in shallow gasps from the bedroom. Clara's phone vibrated. A message from the hospital. A donor had paid the entire surgery fee. Clara wept, hugging her mother. The bill sat on the kitchen counter. Her landlord knocked at the door. He had noticed the damaged pipes in the bathroom. Repairs would cost more. Clara handed over the bill. The landlord took it, his greed evident in his eyes. He walked away grinning. The bill was already burning a hole in his pocket. He went to a casino that night, confident. He placed the $100 bill on a betting table. The bill brought him luck. He won thousands. He ordered champagne. His car was towed. He lost everything to a pickpocket on the way out. The pickpocket, a teenage boy, sold the bill for quick cash to a street vendor. The street vendor handed the bill to a young police officer paying for a hot dog. Officer Eva Chen, 27, with short black hair and kind eyes, tucked the bill into her uniform pocket. She walked her beat. A call came over the radio. A domestic disturbance. Eva responded. A mother was holding her children, crying. The father was drunk and violent. Eva wished for the family to be safe. The bill grew hot against her chest. The father suddenly collapsed, overwhelmed by guilt. He sobbed and promised to change. Eva arrested him, but there was hope in the mother's eyes. The bill vibrated. Eva left the house. A car swerved toward her. She jumped aside, barely avoiding it. She reached into her pocket. The bill was gone. It must have fallen during the accident. A janitor swept the street corner, finding the $100 bill. He tucked it into his cart. He took it home to his wife. She placed it on their small dinner table. They had 2 children. They needed food, medicine, a new roof. She wished for a better life. The bill glowed. A letter arrived the next morning. They had inherited a small property from a distant relative. The property was in disrepair. It cost them everything they had to fix it. They sold the bill to a collector, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and trembling hands. The collector kept it locked in a glass case, admiring its cursed beauty. The bill burned through the glass case, melting it. The collector watched, horrified. He touched it. His own daughter, sick for years, suddenly became well. He cried in relief. His collection room burst into flames. He escaped with the bill and his life. He threw the bill into a river. It floated on the surface, glowing faintly in the dawn light. A fisherman caught it in his net. He dried it and placed it in his wallet. He went home to his village. His wife held him. They were happy for the first time in years. The bill glowed once more. He whispered, I wish for peace for my family. The village was struck by a flood that night. They survived, but lost everything else. The fisherman handed the bill to a traveler, begging him to take it far away. The traveler, a young novelist named Amara, 23, with a weary face and brown hair, tucked the bill into her journal. She knew its story now. She had heard fragments from everyone she'd met. She understood its nature. Amara sat in a coffee shop, sipping black coffee. The bill lay open in her journal. She wrote, "The $100 bill grants one wish. It takes everything else. It always has." A stranger approached her table. He looked ancient, with sharp eyes and a knowing smile. "You understand it," he said, his voice low. "Most never do. They just wish and burn." Amara closed her journal. "Who are you?" She tucked the bill into her pocket. He laughed softly. "I made it. 100 years ago. I wanted to teach people a lesson." Amara stared at him. The bill grew cold against her leg for the first time. "Why create something so cruel?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because people need to learn that happiness isn't a transaction," he replied. Amara took out the bill. She placed it on the table between them. "Take it back," she said. "End this cycle." The man shook his head. "Only you can end it. You know the secret." Amara's eyes widened. She picked up the bill and held it tightly. "I wish for no more wishes," she said firmly. "I wish for this curse to end." The bill exploded into golden light. It disintegrated into ash in her palm. The man vanished. The coffee shop was silent. Amara stood alone. She walked outside. The sun was rising. For the first time in 100 years, the city felt peaceful. Amara smiled. She tucked her hands into her pockets and walked toward her future. Amara walked through the awakening city, the golden ashes still clinging to her fingers like fine dust from a forgotten dream, and she felt the strange lightness in her chest that comes only after setting down an impossible weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She stopped at a small public garden where children were playing and elderly couples sat on benches feeding pigeons, and she thought about Lina, the mother who had wished for her daughter's health and received a flooded apartment in return, and she knew she had to see them all, one by one. The shelter was a gray, weathered building on the edge of the city, and when Amara stepped inside the dimly lit reception area, she found Lina sitting on a plastic chair, Sophia asleep in her lap, her dark hair now brushed and clean, her cheeks full of color that hadn't been there before. Lina looked up with tired but calm eyes, and when she recognized the woman who had appeared in her fragmented memories of that rainy night, she clutched Sophia a little tighter and whispered, "I felt it leave. The weight, the heat, it's gone, isn't it?" Sophia stirred in her mother's arms and opened her eyes, bright and clear, and she reached up with a tiny hand to touch Amara's cheek, laughing a small, bubbly laugh that echoed through the quiet shelter and made everyone around them turn their heads with gentle smiles. Amara knelt beside them and pulled out a worn envelope from her jacket pocket, ordinary money, earned from her own writing work, nothing magical or cursed, and pressed it into Lina's free hand, saying, "This is clean. This is just for you, for a new start, because you deserve it." Lina shook her head at first, her pride warring with her desperation, but then she looked at Sophia's rosy cheeks and the fear that had haunted her for months melted into tears, and she accepted the envelope with trembling fingers, whispering a thank you that carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. Amara stood up and walked toward the shelter's exit, but at the door she turned back and saw Lina holding Sophia close, her shoulders no longer hunched with exhaustion, a genuine smile spreading across her face as the morning sun streamed through a cracked window and bathed them in golden light. The clinic was 2 miles north, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered bakery, and Amara found Marcus sitting on a bench outside, his gaunt cheeks now carrying the faintest hint of color, his sunken eyes more focused, his leather jacket replaced by a simple cotton shirt that looked clean and new. He was fidgeting with a paper cup of water, his hands steady but his gaze distant, and when Amara approached he recognized her immediately, not because they had met before, but because he could see the echo of the bill's energy around her like a dissipating shadow. "It's gone," he said, before she could speak. "The compulsion, the hunger for it. I woke up this morning and I didn't want to chase anything. I just wanted to breathe." His voice cracked, and he pressed the water cup to his forehead as if grounding himself. Amara sat beside him on the bench, her shoulder brushing his, and she told him what she had told Lina. The curse was broken, the cycle was over, and every person who had touched the bill was finally free to make their own choices without invisible strings attached. Marcus let out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to expel years of poison, and he confessed in a low, broken voice that he had been clean for 3 days now, that Gio had vanished the moment the bill left his possession, and that he wanted to try something different, something that didn't make him feel like a ghost. Amara smiled and told him he was not a ghost, just a man who had been carrying too much darkness, and she pointed toward a community center across the street where a sign read Free Trade Skills Program, and she said, "Your hands are steady, use them for building, not taking." She left Marcus staring at that sign with something unfamiliar flickering in his eyes, not greed, not desperation, but a fragile, cautious hope, and she walked toward the commercial district where Delroy's cart used to stand, wondering if the old vendor had survived the chaos. The cart was there, parked in its usual spot, but Delroy had painted it a cheerful yellow and attached a small chalkboard menu with careful handwritten letters, and he was smiling, actually smiling, as he handed a hot dog to a young couple with a toddler on their shoulders. When Delroy saw Amara approaching, his smile widened, and he wiped his hands on his stained apron, still stained but now with mustard and ketchup instead of anxiety, and he called out, "I knew you'd come. I felt the weight lift. My wife's surgery was a success, and she's home now, cooking again." Amara ordered a hot dog, and as Delroy prepared it with extra relish and a warm bun, he told her that the bill's disappearance had allowed him to see clearly for the first time. He had taken out a small loan, just enough to fix his cart and buy better ingredients, and his business was slowly growing with honest, happy customers. She paid him with clean money, and Delroy refused at first, but she insisted, saying, "I'm not cursed, Delroy. I'm just hungry, and I want to taste something made by someone who isn't afraid anymore." The gallery was a sleek, minimalist space on the city's affluent west side, and when Amara stepped inside, she found Maya surrounded by admirers, her blue-streaked hair now professionally styled, her paint-stained coat replaced by a chic black dress that seemed to weigh on her shoulders like armor. Maya's eyes found Amara across the crowded room, and something flickered in them. Recognition, yes, but also a deep, hollow exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with success that felt purchased at too high a price. She excused herself from the admirers and pulled Amara into a quiet storage room filled with unsold paintings where the only light came from a single bulb swinging gently overhead, and she whispered, "I got everything I wanted. Fame, money, recognition, and I feel emptier than I did in that cramped studio." Amara reached out and touched Maya's shoulder, the same gesture she had used with Lina and Marcus, and she said, "The curse is broken, Maya. Whatever the bill granted you, it wasn't real, but the art you made after it, the art born from your own hands and heart, that was always real. Go back to that." Maya stared at her own paint-stained fingers, still bearing faint flecks of color beneath her perfectly manicured nails, and a tear slid down her cheek as she realized that the bill had taken her joy and left only ambition in its place, and she nodded slowly, a new fire kindling behind her tired eyes. The penthouse office was dark and stripped bare when Amara finally found it, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that had once belonged to Victor Sterling, but now the furniture was gone, the desk was missing, and only a single folding chair remained in the center of the vast, echoing room. Victor sat in that chair, his silver gray hair disheveled, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with coffee, his hands clasped loosely in his lap as he stared out at the skyline with the hollow expression of a man who had lost everything that never truly belonged to him anyway. He turned his head when Amara entered, and there was no arrogance left in his gaze, only a quiet, broken humility that made him look older than his 52 years, and he said, "The corporation collapsed, the accounts were frozen. I'm being investigated, and I've never felt so clean." Amara walked to the window and stood beside him, looking down at the tiny cars and pedestrians moving like ants below, and she asked if he regretted anything, and Victor let out a bitter, fragile laugh and admitted that he regretted not realizing sooner that the bill was a mirror, not a reward. He stood up, his legs wobbling slightly, and he told her that Clara had saved him, not the bill, not his wealth, but Clara, who had refused to let him drown in his own greed and had forced him to see the damage he had caused to everyone around him. Clara was waiting in the small, modest office they now shared on the 4th floor of a walk-up building, and when Amara knocked on the open door, she looked up from a stack of papers with sharp, tired eyes that softened the moment she recognized the traveler who had ended the cycle. The office was cluttered with files and photographs, and on the wall hung a framed picture of Clara's mother, now standing tall and healthy, her arm wrapped around Clara's shoulders, both of them laughing under the clear blue sky of a recent afternoon. Clara pushed a cup of tea across the desk toward Amara and said, "My mother walked a full mile yesterday, no breathing tube, no wheelchair, just a woman taking back her life, and I don't owe it to a cursed bill, I owe it to the choices I made after it left me." She explained that she and Victor had formed a small consultancy, advising people on financial recovery after traumatic losses, and that they were both working to help others avoid the traps of greed and quick fixes, using their own bitter experiences as cautionary tales. Amara sipped the tea, warm and soothing, and she felt a deep, quiet satisfaction settle in her chest, not the explosive joy of a wish granted, but the slow, steady warmth of seeing broken people stitch themselves back together without magic, without curses, without shortcuts. She left the office and walked through the city streets again, the afternoon sun casting long, gentle shadows on the pavement, and she noticed that the air felt lighter, the colors brighter, the sounds of traffic and laughter blending into a harmony that had been muffled before by the bill's oppressive presence. A small bookstore caught her eye, tucked between a bakery and a flower shop, its window display featuring leather-bound journals and fountain pens, and Amara felt an irresistible pull toward the simple act of creation, not analysis, not investigation, but pure, unburdened storytelling. She stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming cheerfully, and she browsed the shelves until she found a blank journal with cream-colored pages and a cover of deep forest green, and she bought it with the last of her clean money, feeling the weight of possibility rather than dread. Amara found a park bench near a small pond where ducks paddled lazily, and she opened the journal to the first page, her pen hovering over the empty sheet, and she began to write not the story of the curse, but the story of the people who had survived it, the choices they had made, and the futures they were now building for themselves. She wrote about Lina's radiant smile as Sophia played in the shelter's garden, about Marcus's steady hands learning carpentry at the community center, about Delroy's yellow cart drawing a queue of happy customers, about Maya's new collection of paintings that featured flowers instead of faces, about Clara's mother walking a mile without help. A small girl no older than 7, with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, approached Amara's bench and tilted her head curiously, asking what the grown-up was writing with such a serious expression, and Amara paused her pen to look at the child's innocent face. Amara closed the journal and rested it on her lap, and she told the girl in a warm, gentle voice that she was writing a story about second chances, about how people could make mistakes and still find their way back, about how happiness couldn't be bought but could be built, step by step, day by day. The girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood something profound, and then she giggled, pointed at a duck splashing in the pond, and ran off to join her friends, leaving Amara alone with the quiet hum of the park and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Amara opened the journal again and looked at the words she had written, and she realized that she had stopped writing about the past. She was writing about the present, about the peace that had settled over the city, about the ordinary beautiful moments that no curse could ever tarnish. She closed the journal and stood up, stretching her arms toward the orange and pink sky as the sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in shades of lavender and gold, and she breathed in the cool evening air with a sense of freedom that felt more valuable than any wish. The city around her continued its evening rhythm, commuters heading home, couples walking hand in hand, street musicians tuning their instruments, and Amara realized that the curse's absence wasn't just a negative space, but a fertile ground for genuine happiness to grow, unfettered and authentic. She felt the ashes on her fingers, now completely dry and fading, and she brushed them off onto the grass, watching them scatter like tiny sparks into the twilight, carrying away the last trace of the 100-year-old experiment that had taught so many painful, valuable lessons. Amara walked to the small apartment she had rented for the week, a modest room with a bed, a desk, and a window that faced the east, and she set the green journal on the desk, next to a lamp that cast a warm, steady glow across the pages. She pulled out the photographs she had collected during her journey, snapshots of Lina and Sophia, Marcus at the community center, Delroy at his cart, Maya surrounded by her new paintings, Clara and Victor in their modest office, and she arranged them on the desk like a mosaic of resilience. Looking at those faces, those ordinary yet extraordinary people, Amara felt a tear slide down her cheek, not of sadness, but of profound relief and gratitude, because she understood now that the bill had never been the villain. It had been a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest fears and desires, and they had all chosen, in the end, to look away and find their own light. She closed her eyes, pressed her palm flat against the journal's cover, and whispered a quiet thank you to the stranger who had created the curse. because without him she would never have met these people, never have learned that true happiness isn't a transaction, never have understood that the most powerful wish of all is the one that asks for nothing but the courage to live freely. Amara woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the east-facing window, the green journal still open on her desk, the photographs of her newfound friends arranged like a family portrait, and she felt a quiet urgency to see how each of them was truly doing now that days had passed since the curse's end. She dressed quickly, grabbed her journal and walked first to the shelter, where she found Lina standing outside with Sophia, both of them wearing bright new clothes, and Lina was holding a small application form for a job at a nearby daycare center. "I never thought I could work again," Lina admitted, her voice steady and strong, as Sophia tugged at her hand and pointed at a passing butterfly. "But the shelter director told me they need someone who understands children, and I realized I know more than I thought." Amara smiled and offered to watch Sophia for an hour so Lina could go to the interview, and Lina hesitated at first, her protective instincts flaring, but then she looked at her daughter's trusting face and nodded, handing over a small bag of snacks and a spare diaper. Sophia sat on a park bench with Amara, drawing colorful pictures with crayons on a paper pad, her small tongue poking out in concentration, and she looked up at Amara with serious eyes and said, "Mama is happy now. She doesn't cry at night anymore." Amara felt a lump in her throat and she hugged Sophia gently, watching the children play in the nearby sandbox, and she thought about how the curse had taken so much from so many, but it had also given them the chance to rebuild with stronger foundations. 2 hours later, Lina returned from the interview with a radiant smile, clutching a job offer letter in her trembling hands, and she fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around Sophia, sobbing with joy, while Amara stood back and let them have their moment. That afternoon, Amara visited the community center where Marcus was now a regular student, and she found him in the carpentry workshop, his hands steady and sure as he sanded a wooden chair, his gaunt face now filled out with healthy color and a genuine smile. "Look at this," Marcus said, holding up the chair, its legs perfectly even, its surface smooth. "I made it from scratch. No shortcuts, no magic, just wood, patience, and a teacher who believed in me." He laughed, a sound that was still rusty but becoming more natural. The instructor, a burly older man with a gray beard, clapped Marcus on the shoulder and told Amara that Marcus was one of his most dedicated students, that he had a natural talent for joinery, and that he was already taking on small commissions from local families. Marcus showed Amara a small wooden bird he had carved as a gift for Sophia, his fingers tracing its delicate wings, and he said, "I want to make things that bring joy, not pain. That's my new purpose." His eyes glistened with tears, but he blinked them away. Amara left the workshop with the wooden bird in her pocket, and she walked toward Delroy's cart, but when she arrived she found a line of customers stretching around the block, and Delroy was frantically flipping burgers with a grin of pure exhausted happiness. "Amara, you came at the perfect time," Delroy shouted, handing her an apron and a spatula. "I need extra hands. My wife is at physical therapy, and my usual helper called in sick. Can you work the register?" Amara laughed and jumped behind the cart, taking orders and making change with surprising speed, and for the next 2 hours, she and Delroy worked side by side, serving dozens of customers, the yellow cart becoming a small beacon of community cheer. When the rush finally ended, Delroy collapsed onto a folding chair, sweating and grinning, and he told Amara that his business had tripled in the past week, that he was planning to open a small food truck, and that he owed it all to the lesson the curse had taught him, to appreciate every honest day's work. As the sun began to set, Amara walked to the gallery, but this time she didn't find Maya surrounded by admirers. She found her in the back studio, alone, wearing her old paint-stained coat, her blue hair messy and free, splashing vibrant colors onto a large canvas with reckless joy. Maya turned when she heard footsteps, her face and hands covered in paint, a wild smile on her face, and she said, "I fired my agent. I canceled all my shows. I'm starting over, painting what I love, not what sells, and it's terrifying and wonderful." She gestured to the canvas, a chaotic explosion of oranges and blues and greens that seemed to pulse with life, and she said, "This is the first thing I've painted that feels like me in years. It's not perfect, it's not marketable, but it's real." Amara stood beside her and looked at the painting, and she felt the same electricity she had felt when she first saw Maya's work, before the curse had twisted her ambition, and she told Maya that this was the art the world needed to see, not polished, not safe, but honest. I never thought I'd be doing this, Victor admitted, his silver hair now neatly combed, his suit replaced by a simple blazer. I spent decades chasing numbers and power, and all it gave me was isolation. Now I help people chase stability, and I've never felt more connected. Clara nodded, her sharp features softened by exhaustion and satisfaction, and she told Amara that their next project was to create a free financial literacy program for low-income neighborhoods because they knew firsthand how desperation could lead to bad choices. Amara listened and felt a deep warmth spread through her, and she realized that the city was slowly healing, not because of any magical intervention, but because ordinary people were choosing to be better, to help each other, and to learn from their mistakes. The next morning, a young journalist named Lina, 24, with bright green eyes and a notebook always in hand, knocked on Amara's apartment door, having heard rumors of a strange $100 bill and a woman who had broken its curse. Lina was skeptical but curious, her reporter's instinct tingling, and she asked Amara for an interview, promising to write the truth and not sensationalize it, and Amara, after a long pause, agreed because she knew the story deserved to be told. Lina caught Amara's eye through the glass and gave her a thumbs up, her smile wider than Amara had ever seen it, and Amara knew that Lina had finally found the piece she had been searching for all along. Marcus completed his carpentry certification with honors, and his first commissioned piece, a set of handmade bookshelves for a local library, was unveiled at a small ceremony where the librarian praised his craftsmanship and his generosity in donating his time. Marcus stood awkwardly beside the shelves, his hands shoved in his pockets, but when the librarian asked him to say a few words, he cleared his throat and said, "I used to take things, now I build them, and it feels 100 times better." The crowd laughed and applauded, and Marcus caught Amara's eye from across the room, and he gave her a small, grateful nod that said everything he couldn't put into words. Delroy's food truck was officially launched on a sunny Saturday, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by dozens of loyal customers, and he had painted it the same cheerful yellow with a new menu that featured his wife's secret recipes. His wife, now fully recovered, stood beside him, her arm linked through his, and they both cried happy tears as the first customer ordered a Delroy's deluxe burger, and Amara, standing in the crowd, felt her heart swell with joy. Maya's new exhibition, titled Unfiltered, opened at a small independent gallery, featuring her chaotic, honest paintings, and the opening night was packed not with critics and collectors, but with ordinary people who simply loved the raw emotion in every brushstroke. Maya wore her paint-stained coat proudly, her blue hair a messy halo, and she gave an impromptu speech about finding her voice again, about breaking free from the need for approval, and about the one person who had helped her see that true art comes from the heart. She looked directly at Amara in the audience and mouthed, "Thank you," and Amara nodded back, tears streaming down her own face because she knew that this was the real victory, not fame, not money, but the freedom to create without fear. Clara and Victor's financial literacy program held its first workshop in a community center, and the room was filled with people from all walks of life, young adults, single parents, retirees, all eager to learn how to manage their money and avoid the traps of desperation. Clara led the session with confidence and compassion, while Victor helped with the materials and answered individual questions, and by the end several participants came up to thank them, saying they finally felt hope for their financial futures. After the workshop, Clara and Victor treated themselves to a simple dinner at a noodle shop, and Victor admitted that he had never been happier, even though his bank account was a fraction of what it used to be, because the weight of guilt had been lifted. Amara attended all these events, documenting them in her green journal, and she realized that the story she was writing was no longer about the curse, but about the resilience of the human spirit, and that was far more powerful. One evening, as she sat on her apartment balcony watching the stars, a familiar figure appeared at the fire escape, the ancient stranger, but now looking younger, his sharp eyes softer, his smile more gentle than before. "You did what I could not," he said, sitting beside her, his voice no longer mysterious but almost paternal. "You gave them the gift of choice. You broke the cycle with a wish that asked for nothing. I am proud of you." Amara looked at him and felt no fear, only a quiet acceptance, and she asked if he would ever create another cursed object, and he laughed softly and shook his head, saying, "No, I've learned my lesson too. The greatest magic is the magic people make for themselves. He vanished as silently as he had come, leaving only the faint scent of old books and the distant sound of church bells, and Amara closed her journal, looked up at the stars, and whispered to the universe, "This is just the beginning." Amara sat on the balcony for a long time after the stranger vanished, the night air cool against her skin, and she replayed every word he had spoken, realizing that his final lesson was the most important one of all. The magic of choice was now in everyone's hands. She went inside and opened her green journal to a fresh page, and she began to write a new chapter, not about the curse, not about the people she had met, but about the city itself, and how it was slowly transforming into something more compassionate and connected. Weeks passed, and Amara became a familiar face in every corner of the city, at Lina's daycare center where she read stories to the children, at Marcus's workshop where she learned to sand wood and assemble simple furniture, and at Delroy's food truck where she occasionally helped during lunch rushes. She became friends with Maya, spending late nights in the studio watching her paint, the two of them talking about art and life and the strange journey that had brought them together. And Maya often said that Amara's quiet presence was like a compass, always pointing her back to what mattered. Clara and Victor's financial literacy program expanded to 5 community centers across the city, and Amara helped them develop a simple, illustrated guidebook that explained budgeting and saving in clear, accessible language, which became wildly popular. One evening, Amara received a letter from Daniel, the young man who had torn up his contract after reading Elena's article, and he wrote that his startup was thriving, that he had found honest investors, and that he was now mentoring other young entrepreneurs to avoid the traps he had almost fallen into. Amara smiled as she read the letter, and she tucked it into her journal alongside the photographs of her friends, the collection growing into a rich tapestry of resilience and second chances that she would treasure forever. Elena's article had been translated into several languages and published internationally, and people from all over the world wrote to Amara, sharing their own stories of curses they had overcome, not magical ones, but the curses of poverty, addiction, fear, and isolation. Amara responded to as many as she could, and she realized that her purpose was no longer just to document the story, but to be a listener, a witness, someone who held space for others to share their burdens and find their own paths forward. She started a small online community called the Second Chance Circle, where people could share their struggles and victories anonymously, offering support and encouragement without judgment, and the community grew faster than she could have imagined. Lina's daughter Sophia started kindergarten, and Lina cried happy tears as she watched her little girl walk through the school gates, a bright backpack on her shoulders and a smile that lit up the entire playground. Marcus was offered a full-time position at the community center as an assistant instructor, teaching carpentry to other recovering addicts, and he accepted with humility and determination, saying that he wanted to pass on the second chance he had been given. Delroy and his wife opened a second food truck, this one specializing in desserts, and they named it Sweet Redemption in honor of the journey they had all been through, and the 2 trucks became beloved fixtures in the city's food scene. Maya's exhibition traveled to 3 other cities, and critics who had once dismissed her work now praised her raw honesty and emotional depth, but Maya remained grounded, always returning to her small studio and her paint-stained coat. Clara and Victor were invited to speak at a national conference on financial literacy, and they stood on stage together, 2 unlikely partners who had found purpose in helping others, and they told the story of how failure had been their greatest teacher. Amara attended the conference, sitting in the front row, and when Clara and Victor mentioned her in their speech, calling her the catalyst for their transformation, she felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and pride. After the conference, a woman approached Amara in the lobby, a stranger with tired eyes and trembling hands, and she said she had read the article and wanted to know if the curse was truly gone because she had been carrying her own version of it for years. Amara took the woman's hand and led her to a quiet corner, and she listened for an hour as the woman poured out her story of a failed marriage, a lost career, and the weight of regret that had followed her every step. When the woman finished, Amara smiled gently and told her that the curse wasn't a bill or a magical object. It was the belief that one mistake could define an entire life, and that belief was the real curse that needed to be broken. The woman looked up with tear-filled eyes, a fragile hope flickering in her expression, and she asked Amara how to break it, and Amara replied, "You start by forgiving yourself, and then you take one small step forward, even if it's terrifying." That night, Amara added the woman's story to her journal, and she realized that the true legacy of the $100 bill was not the chaos it had caused, but the connections it had forged between people who might never have met otherwise. A film producer reached out to Elena, wanting to option the rights to her article and turn it into a documentary, and Elena called Amara to discuss it, both of them nervous and excited about the possibility of reaching even more people. They met at their usual coffee shop, the same one where the stranger had first appeared, and they spent hours brainstorming how to tell the story honestly, without sensationalizing the pain or romanticizing the magic. Elena suggested they interview every person who had touched the bill, weaving their testimonies together into a narrative that showed the full spectrum of human experience: the greed, the fear, the regret, and ultimately the redemption. Amara agreed, and she proposed that the documentary end not with the destruction of the bill, but with the new lives that everyone had built afterward, because that was the real story, not the curse, but the cure. The next day, Amara began to gather everyone together for the interviews, starting with Lina, who sat in the shelter's garden with Sophia on her lap and spoke about the moment she had first picked up the bill, her voice steady and full of hard-won wisdom. Lina told the camera that the bill had taken her home, but it had also given her the courage to believe that she deserved better, and she had used that courage to build a life she was proud of, one day at a time. Marcus was interviewed in his workshop, surrounded by the tools that had become extensions of his own hands, and he admitted that he still had nightmares sometimes, but he woke up every morning grateful that he had survived to build something new. Delroy sat behind his yellow food truck, his wife beside him, and he laughed as he described the moment the bill had first come to him, saying that he had learned that real wealth wasn't about money, it was about the people who stood by you when you had nothing. Maya painted while she talked, her hands covered in blue and orange paint, and she described the bill as a dark mirror that had shown her everything she was afraid to see, and she thanked it for the push, even as she wished it had never existed. Clara spoke in her modest office, the photograph of her mother on the wall behind her, and she said that the bill had taught her the difference between a wish and a dream. A wish was something you hoped would happen, but a dream was something you built with your own hands. Victor sat in the same stripped penthouse where Amara had first found him, the city skyline sprawling behind him, and he confessed with humility that the bill had taken everything he thought he valued, only to show him what truly mattered: connection, integrity, and second chances. The fisherman and his wife spoke from their small village home, their flood-damaged property now repaired, and they said that losing everything had made them realize that the only thing they truly needed was each other. The collector, now living in a modest apartment with his daughter, who was healthy and strong, said that the bill had burned through his obsession with possessing beauty, and he was finally free to appreciate it without needing to own it. The pickpocket was never found, but his story was told by the street vendor who had bought the bill from him, and the vendor said that the boy had written a letter years later saying he had turned his life around and become a social worker. Even the landlord who had lost the bill at the casino was interviewed, now working as a doorman at a modest hotel, and he admitted with a wry smile that the bill had been the worst luck and the best lesson of his life, teaching him that gambling with greed always loses. Elena's documentary team filmed for 3 months, capturing the mundane and the profound moments, the laughter and the tears, the quiet victories and the ongoing struggles, and Amara was there for every interview, a silent witness to the healing. The documentary premiered at a small independent theater, and the screening room was filled with every person who had been part of the journey: Lina and Sophia, Marcus, Delroy and his wife Maya, Clara, Victor, the fisherman and his wife, and even the collector. They sat together in the dark, watching their own faces flicker on the screen, reliving the pain and the triumph, and when the credits rolled, there was not a dry eye in the room, including Amara's. After the screening, they gathered at Delroy's food truck, which he had parked outside the theater, and they ate burgers and fries and laughed about how absurd it all was: a cursed bill, a broken cycle, and a family forged from chaos. Lina held Sophia on her lap, and Marcus sat beside them, showing the little girl a new wooden toy he had carved for her, a tiny horse with a flowing mane that seemed to gallop in the moonlight. Delroy's wife brought out a cake she had baked, a simple vanilla cake with buttercream frosting, and on top, written in blue and orange icing, were the words "Second Chance," and everyone cheered as she lit the candles. Maya had painted a small portrait of each person in the group, and she handed them out as gifts, her eyes shining with tears as she watched them admire their own faces rendered in her vibrant, honest style. Victor stood apart from the group for a moment, looking out at the city lights, and Clara joined him, and they talked about how strange it was to feel so whole after years of feeling so empty, and they agreed that the bill had been a terrible gift that had led to something beautiful. Amara watched them all from a few feet away, her green journal tucked under her arm, and she felt a peace settle over her that she had never known before, a peace that came not from solving all the world's problems but from knowing that even broken people could find their way home. The night ended with everyone promising to stay in touch, to meet once a month for dinner, to be a support system for each other because they knew better than anyone how fragile happiness could be and how fiercely it needed to be protected. 2 weeks later, Amara received a letter from the ancient stranger, postmarked from a country she had never heard of, and inside was a single sentence written in elegant, old-fashioned script. "You have done what I could not. The cycle is truly broken. Thank you." Amara held the letter for a long time, and then she tucked it into her journal beside the photographs and the letters from strangers, and she smiled because she knew that the stranger had finally found his own peace as well. Her online community, the Second Chance Circle, had grown to thousands of members, and she spent several hours each day reading their posts, offering words of encouragement, and connecting people who could help each other. One day, a member posted about a young mother who had lost everything in a house fire and was struggling to rebuild, and Amara shared the post with her network, and within a week the community had raised enough money to rent the woman a new apartment. Another member wrote about a teenager who was being bullied at school and felt like giving up, and Amara connected her with a counselor and a support group, and months later, the teenager wrote back to say she had found friends who accepted her for who she was. Amara realized that the true legacy of the $100 bill was this: a network of people who had learned that help wasn't a transaction, it was a gift, freely given and gratefully received, and it grew stronger the more it was shared. She began to write a book, weaving together all the stories she had collected, not as a sensationalized account of a curse, but as a meditation on resilience, on the human capacity to fail and rise again, and on the quiet miracles that happen when people choose to be kind. The book was titled The $100 Lesson, and it was published by a small independent press that believed in its message, and it didn't sell millions of copies, but it sold enough to touch the lives of everyone who read it. Amara did book readings at libraries and community centers, and at every event at least one person would come up to her afterward and share their own story, and she would listen just as she had always done. Sophia, now 6 years old, was learning to read, and she proudly showed Amara her favorite book, a children's story about a little rabbit who lost his carrot but found a friend, and she told Amara that it was her favorite because it reminded her of when her mother had found hope again. Lina was promoted to assistant director at the daycare center, and she was known for her patience, her kindness, and the way she could calm even the most upset child with a gentle word and a warm hug. Marcus had taken on an apprentice, a young man named Leo, 22, who had been struggling with addiction, and Marcus taught him not just carpentry, but the patience and self-respect that came from creating something with your own hands. Delroy and his wife were considering opening a third food truck, this one specializing in breakfast, and they joked that they were becoming a food empire, but they never forgot where they came from and always made sure to give leftover food to shelters every night. Maya had found a new style, a fusion of abstract expressionism and portraiture that captured the emotions of people who had survived trauma, and her work was now featured in galleries across the country, but she still painted in her small studio every night. Clara and Victor had been invited to speak at the United Nations about financial literacy and social entrepreneurship, and they stood on that world stage, two ordinary people from the same city, telling a story that had changed their lives. Amara watched the video of their speech on her laptop, a proud smile on her face, and she thought about how far they had all come, from a cursed bill to a world stage, from desperation to purpose, from loneliness to community. The fisherman and his wife had rebuilt their village home and had opened a small guest house for travelers, and they often told the story of the glowing bill to their guests, warning them about the danger of shortcuts and the value of hard work. The collector had donated his remaining artifacts to a museum and now worked as a volunteer guide, sharing his knowledge of history and art with children, his daughter often beside him, healthy and happy. Even the street vendor who had first taken the bill from Marcus had found his own redemption. He had started a small charity that provided meals to homeless families, and he said the bill had shown him that a single act of kindness could change everything. Amara's book was translated into 12 languages, and she received invitations to speak in countries she had never visited, but she declined most of them, preferring to stay close to her community and continue the work that mattered most to her. One evening, as she sat on her balcony writing in her journal, a shooting star streaked across the sky, and Amara closed her eyes and made a wish not for herself but for everyone she had ever met, that they would always remember how strong they were. When she opened her eyes, she saw a small folded piece of paper on the balcony railing, and she picked it up and unfolded it, reading the words written in the ancient stranger's elegant script, "Your wish is granted, for them, for always." Amara smiled and tucked the paper into her journal, and she knew that the stranger was still watching, still learning, still growing, and that he had finally understood what she had known all along. The greatest magic was the love we gave to each other. She went inside and closed her journal, and she slept peacefully for the first time in months, dreaming of a world where everyone had the courage to choose hope over fear, kindness over greed, and connection over isolation. The next morning, Amara woke to the sound of birds singing outside her window, and she knew it was time to start a new chapter, not just in her journal but in her life, because the story of the $100 bill was no longer about the past, but about the future. She packed a small bag, left her apartment, and walked to the train station, because she had decided to travel and collect more stories, to find more people who had broken their own curses, and to share their voices with the world. Her friends gathered at the station to see her off: Lina and Sophia, Marcus, Delroy and his wife, Maya, Clara and Victor, even the fisherman and his wife who had traveled to the city for a visit, and they all hugged her and promised to stay in touch. Sophia gave Amara a small drawing of a butterfly, and she said, "This is for you, so you always remember that even caterpillars can fly," and Amara tucked it into her journal with tears in her eyes. The train pulled into the station, and Amara stepped aboard, turning back one last time to wave at her friends, her family, the people who had taught her that a cursed bill could lead to the most beautiful blessings. As the train began to move, Amara opened her journal to the very first page, and she wrote a new title above all the stories: "The Cursed Bill and the Beautiful Blessing," because she finally understood that the two were never really separate. The train carried her out of the city, through green hills and small towns, and she watched the world pass by, her eyes open to the beauty and the pain and the resilience of the people she would meet. She thought about all the strangers who would become friends, all the curses that would become lessons, all the endings that would become beginnings, and she knew that the story was far from over. It was just beginning a new chapter. Amara closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the train soothe her, and she whispered to herself, "This is not the end. This is the promise of everything that is still to come." The train whistle blew, echoing across the countryside, and Amara opened her eyes and smiled, because she had finally learned that the most powerful wish wasn't a transaction. It was a commitment to keep showing up, keep listening, and keep loving no matter what. She pulled out her journal, turned to a fresh page, and began to write, her pen moving across the paper like a gentle breeze, capturing the moment, the journey, and the infinite possibilities of a life lived with purpose and grace. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting golden light across the fields, and Amara knew that her story, like the stories of all her friends, was not about a curse overcome, but about the courage to keep moving forward, even when the path was uncertain. She thought about the ancient stranger and his 100-year experiment, and she felt a strange gratitude for his mistake, because without it she would never have found her purpose, her community, or her own quiet, unshakable peace. The train rounded a bend, and a new city appeared on the horizon, its spires and rooftops glinting in the morning sun, and Amara felt a thrill of anticipation for the stories that awaited her there. She tucked her journal into her bag and stood up as the train slowed, ready to step into the unknown, ready to listen, ready to witness, ready to love, because she had finally learned that the answer to every curse was not a wish but a choice. And as the train came to a stop and the doors slid open, Amara stepped onto the platform, her heart full and her eyes bright, and she walked forward into her future, grateful for every moment that had brought her here. The station was bustling with travelers, each with their own stories, their own curses, their own hopes, and Amara smiled because she knew that somewhere among them was someone who needed to be heard, someone whose story would become part of her ever-growing tapestry. She found a small cafe near the station, ordered a cup of coffee, and opened her journal to a fresh page, and she wrote, Chapter 1, The Journey Continues. Amara spent her first week in the new city simply walking its streets, observing its rhythms, its people, its hidden corners and bustling avenues, and she filled page after page of her journal with observations that would later become the foundation of new friendships and new stories. She found a small apartment above a bakery where the scent of fresh bread and cinnamon filled her room every morning, and she began to establish a new routine, writing, exploring, and waiting for the stories to find her, as they always seemed to do. One afternoon, while sitting in a park watching children play, a young man approached her, his hands trembling, his eyes red from crying, and he asked if she was the woman who wrote about the cursed bill because he had read the article and needed to talk to someone who understood. His name was Kai, 25, with short black hair and a haunted expression, and he told Amara that he had inherited a family heirloom, a pocket watch that seemed to bring bad luck to everyone who touched it, and he didn't know what to do. Amara listened as Kai described how his grandfather had passed down the watch, warning that it carried a curse, and how his father had suffered a series of misfortunes after accepting it, and now Kai felt the weight of the watch pressing on his life like a lead blanket. She asked to see the watch, and Kai pulled it from his pocket, a beautiful antique piece with gold filigree and an intricate face, its hands frozen at 11:59 as if time itself had stopped the moment the curse began. Amara held the watch gently, feeling no magical warmth, no strange energy, only the cool weight of metal and the heavy grief of a family burdened by belief in a curse that had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. She told Kai that the watch wasn't cursed, it was a story his family had told themselves for so long that they had shaped their lives around it, creating the very misfortunes they feared. Kai looked at her with confusion and desperation, wanting to believe her but too afraid to let go of the story that had defined his family for generations, and Amara understood that breaking a curse wasn't always about magic, sometimes it was about rewriting the narrative. She suggested that Kai give the watch to a museum, to place it among other artifacts where it could be seen as history rather than destiny, and she offered to go with him to make the donation if that would make it easier. Kai hesitated, his fingers clutching the watch, and then he nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face, and he whispered that he had carried the weight of his family's fear for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be free. They walked to the city's history museum together, and Kai handed the watch to a curator with trembling hands, explaining that it was a family heirloom that he wanted to donate, and the curator accepted it with gratitude, promising to display it with respect. As they left the museum, Kai stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, his face tilted up toward the sun, and he took a deep breath that seemed to draw the very light into his chest, and he said, "I feel lighter. I can't explain it, but I feel lighter." Amara smiled and told him that he had just broken his first curse, not with magic, but with courage, with the decision to let go of a story that no longer served him and to write a new one instead. Kai hugged her, a sudden fierce embrace that caught her off guard, and then he stepped back, embarrassed and laughing, and he promised to pay it forward, to help others who were trapped by their own family narratives. That night, Amara added Kai's story to her journal, and she realized that the journey was teaching her something new, that curses came in many forms, and the most insidious ones were often the stories we inherited without questioning. The next week, Amara met a woman named Lina, 30, with kind eyes and a tired smile, who ran a small community garden in a neglected part of the city, and who was fighting to keep the garden open despite the city's plans to sell the land. Lina told Amara that the garden was the only green space in the neighborhood, the only place where children could play in the dirt and elderly residents could sit and remember their own gardens from their youth, and she refused to let it be taken away. Amara spent the afternoon helping Lina plant new seedlings, their hands covered in soil, and she listened as Lina spoke about the neighbors who had lost hope, the children who had never seen a flower grow from a seed, and the families who had no money for fresh vegetables. She asked Lina what she would wish for if she had one wish, and Lina laughed and said, "I'd wish for people to remember that they're part of something bigger than themselves, that we all need each other to survive." Amara felt a familiar warmth in her chest, not from magic but from recognition, because Nina's words echoed the lesson she had learned from the $100 bill, that connection was the only true currency, and love was the only magic that lasted. She decided to help Lina save the garden, and she used her online community to raise awareness, posting photos of the garden and sharing Lina's story, and within days, hundreds of people had signed petitions and offered to volunteer. Local news picked up the story, and soon the city council was forced to reconsider its decision, and Nina's garden became a symbol of community resistance, a small patch of green that had grown into a movement. At a public hearing, Nina stood before the council and spoke with quiet passion, her voice steady and her hands clasped in front of her, and she told them that the garden wasn't just land, it was memory, it was hope, it was the beating heart of a neighborhood that refused to be forgotten. The council voted to preserve the garden, and Nina wept with joy, hugging Amara so tightly that they both nearly fell over, and the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed through the city hall and into the streets beyond. Amara helped organize a grand reopening celebration with food from Delroy's food trucks, which he had driven to the city to support her, and artwork from Maya, who had painted a beautiful mural of the garden on the fence that surrounded it. Delroy's yellow truck and his new Sweet Redemption dessert truck were parked side by side, serving hundreds of visitors, and Delroy grinned as he flipped burgers and handed out ice cream, telling everyone who would listen about the girl who had helped him find his second chance. Maya's mural was a vibrant explosion of flowers and faces, the faces of every person who had helped save the garden, including Nina, Amara, the volunteers, and even the children who played there, and it became a beloved landmark that drew visitors from across the city. Marcus had come to the celebration too, bringing a set of handmade wooden benches for the garden, each one carved with the name of a different flower, and he installed them himself, his hands steady and his smile wide. Sophia was there with Lina, running through the garden with other children, her laughter bright as she chased butterflies, and Lina stood beside Amara, watching her daughter with the quiet contentment of a mother who had once feared she would lose everything. Clara and Victor arrived in the afternoon, having come to support Amara and to see the garden that had captured so many hearts, and they offered to help Nina with financial planning and fundraising for the garden's future. Victor looked at the garden, at the children laughing and the flowers blooming and the community gathered together, and he said to Amara, "This is more beautiful than any penthouse view I ever had. This is what real wealth looks like." Maya and Marcus stood together by the mural, talking about their shared journey, and Maya laughed as she pointed out the tiny details she had hidden in the painting. A small wooden bird for Marcus, a paintbrush for herself, a butterfly for Sophia, a dollar bill for Amara. Amara saw the hidden dollar bill in the mural and laughed because it was faded and subtle, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, and she realized that Maya had turned the curse into art, transforming pain into beauty. The celebration lasted until sunset, when the garden was lit with fairy lights that Amara and the volunteers had strung across the trees, and everyone sat on Marcus's benches, eating cake and sharing stories and laughing under the stars. Nina gave a speech at the end of the night, thanking Amara for coming into her life and reminding her that even the smallest patch of earth could be holy when tended with love, and she presented Amara with a tiny seedling in a pot, a new beginning. Amara accepted the seedling with tears in her eyes, and she promised to plant it wherever she went next, to carry the garden's spirit with her as a reminder that growth was always possible, no matter how rocky the soil. She stayed in the city for another month, helping Nina establish a community program that taught children how to grow their own food, and she watched as the garden became a place where healing happened, where people from all walks of life came together to plant and harvest and hope. When it was finally time to leave, the garden was thriving. The benches were worn from constant use, and the mural was weathered but beautiful, and Nina hugged Amara at the train station and said, "You planted something here that no curse could ever touch." Amara boarded the train with her green journal, the seedling safely wrapped in a damp cloth, and she waved goodbye to Nina and the garden and the city that had taught her that sometimes the most powerful magic was simply showing up and paying attention. She traveled next to a coastal town, where the sea air was salty and the wind carried the cries of seagulls, and she found a community of fishermen who had survived a devastating storm and were slowly rebuilding their lives. She met an old woman named Alara, 74, with silver hair and deep wrinkles like maps of the ocean, who sat on the dock every morning and knitted sweaters for the children, and who told stories that made the past feel alive. Alara told Amara that she had lost her husband to the storm and her son to grief, and that sometimes she felt like the only one left standing, but she kept knitting because it was the only thing that made her hands feel useful. Amara sat beside Alara for hours, listening to her stories about the sea and the people she had loved and lost, and she realized that Alara's grief was its own kind of curse, a weight that had settled into her bones and made it hard to move forward. She asked Alara what she would wish for if she could have anything, and Alara looked out at the ocean with tired eyes and said, "I'd wish for my son to come home, but I know he won't, so I'd wish for the courage to let him go." Amara felt the ache of that wish in her own chest, and she knew that Alara's curse wasn't magical. It was the curse of holding on too tightly, of loving someone so much that you forgot to love yourself. She spent her days in the coastal town helping Alara with her knitting, learning the patterns and the rhythms, and she listened to the stories of the other fishermen, gathering their tales of survival and loss and quiet hope. One evening, Alara stopped knitting and looked at Amara with sharp, clear eyes, and she said, "You're not here to collect stories. You're here to help people find the ones they need to tell themselves. That's a gift." Amara was speechless, because Alara had seen right through her, had understood the purpose she had been carrying without fully naming it. She was a witness, a listener, someone who held space for others to find their own voices. That night, she wrote in her journal about Alara and the fishermen and the sea, and she realized that every story she collected was a thread in a tapestry that connected her to every person she met, a web of shared humanity that could never be broken. Weeks passed and Alara's son never returned, but Alara started sleeping better, eating better, and she began to knit brighter colors, yellows and blues and greens that matched the sea at dawn. She told Amara that she had finally let go, not because she didn't love her son, but because she loved him enough to release him to his own path, and that realization had lifted a weight she had been carrying for years. Amara left the coastal town with the seedling still growing in its pot, now with tiny green leaves that reached toward the sun, and she felt a deep gratitude for Alara and the lesson she had taught about the courage it took to release the ones you loved. She traveled inland next, through rolling hills and small villages, and she found herself in a town that had been divided by an old feud, two families who had been fighting for so long that no one remembered how it had started. She met a young man named Leo, 23, with kind eyes and a heavy heart, who was the grandson of the family's patriarch, and a young woman named Mila, 22, with bright red hair and a fierce spirit, who was the granddaughter of the other family's matriarch. Leo and Mila were in love, but their families forbade them from seeing each other, and they had been meeting in secret for months, terrified of the consequences if they were discovered. Amara found them sitting by a river, their hands intertwined, their faces full of longing and despair, and they told her their story, the feud, the hatred, the generations of pain that had been passed down like a curse. She listened without judgment, and then she asked them what they would wish for, and they both said, almost in unison, "We wish our families would see us as people, not as enemies." Amara knew that this was the hardest kind of curse to break, the curse of inherited hatred, the story that had been told for so long that it felt like truth, and she decided to help them write a new story. She arranged a meeting between Leo's grandfather and Mila's grandmother, a neutral space where they could talk without anger, and she prepared them by telling her own story, the story of the cursed bill and the people who had broken its cycle. The meeting was tense at first, filled with accusations and old resentments, but Amara stayed calm and reminded them that they were both grieving the same thing, the loss of family, the weight of a history that had stolen their joy. Slowly, the old man and the old woman began to speak not as enemies, but as two people who had both lost too much to hatred, and they discovered that they shared more sorrow than they had ever imagined. The grandfather admitted that he had been waiting for someone to tell him it was okay to forgive, and the grandmother admitted that she had been waiting for someone to tell her the same thing. Amara watched as they reached across the table and held hands, two old people who had wasted decades on bitterness, finally choosing peace over pride, and she felt tears streaming down her own face. The feud officially ended that night, and Leo and Mila were finally free to love each other openly, and they celebrated with a small gathering that brought both families together for the first time in 50 years. Amara stayed for the wedding, a simple ceremony by the river where Leo and Mila exchanged vows, and everyone who attended could feel the healing in the air, a curse broken not by magic, but by the simple, radical act of choosing forgiveness. Alara sent a knitted blanket as a wedding gift, and Maya sent a painting of the river, and Marcus sent a wooden arch for the ceremony, and Delroy sent a cake, and everyone who had been part of the journey sent their love. Amara realized that her community had grown beyond the city, beyond the country. It was a network of people who had learned that curses were meant to be broken, and that love was always worth the risk. She wrote about Leo and Mila in her journal, and she added their story to the tapestry, and she felt a sense of profound peace because she knew that her work was never finished. There would always be more stories, more curses, more chances to help. She left the town with the seedling now strong and healthy, ready to be planted in its next home, and she traveled to a mountain village where the air was thin and the stars were so bright they seemed to hang just above her head. There she met a recluse named Zara, 48, who lived alone in a small cabin and painted the mountains every day, but who never showed her paintings to anyone, hiding them away in a locked room. Zara was wary of strangers, but she had heard about Amara from a traveling merchant, and she was curious enough to let Amara stay for one night to see if she could be trusted. That night, Zara opened her locked room and showed Amara her paintings, hundreds of them, each one more breathtaking than the last, capturing the mountains in every season, every light, every mood. Amara was speechless, overwhelmed by the beauty of the work, and she asked Zara why she hid them. And Zara said, "Because they're not good enough, because no one would understand, because I'm afraid they'll see me and find me lacking." Amara recognized the curse immediately, the curse of perfectionism, the fear of being seen, the belief that if you shared your true self you would be rejected, and she knew that Zara's paintings deserved to be seen. She told Zara about Maya, about how she had been trapped by the need for approval until she had freed herself and started painting for joy alone, and she encouraged Zara to take the same leap. Zara was terrified, but she was also tired of hiding, tired of the weight of her own fear, tired of watching her paintings gather dust in a locked room. She agreed to show one painting, just one, at a small local exhibition that Amara helped organize, and when the day came, Zara's hands trembled as she hung it on the wall. The exhibition was small, just a few dozen villagers, but they gathered around Zara's painting with expressions of awe and wonder, and one by one they told her that her work was beautiful, that it made them feel something they hadn't felt in years. Zara wept, not because she was sad, but because she had finally been seen, and that vision had set her free from the prison of her own doubt, and she hugged Amara with the fierce gratitude of a woman who had been given a second chance. Amara stayed in the mountain village for a few more weeks, helping Zara arrange a small gallery in the village center where her paintings could be displayed for everyone to see, and the gallery became a destination for travelers who came to see the mountains through Zara's eyes. She planted the seedling outside the gallery, where it would grow into a tree that would shelter visitors and remind everyone that growth was possible, even in the harshest conditions. Zara's story joined the others in Amara's journal, and she realized that every person she met was teaching her something new about the nature of curses and the courage it took to break them. She traveled down from the mountains, through forests and valleys, and she arrived in a city that was recovering from a terrible flood, the streets still muddy, the buildings still scarred by water. There she met a community of volunteers who had come from everywhere to help with the recovery, and among them was a man named Jin, 27, who was organizing the relief efforts with calm efficiency and a quiet smile. Jin had lost his own home in the flood, but he had refused to leave, refusing to abandon the city that had given him his start, and he worked tirelessly day and night to help others rebuild.